Episode 30 of the Geekdom101 podcast is part 2 of our continuing discussion with author and content creator David Stewart. Make sure you check out part 1 in the archives on Realm of Geekdom because it is 2 parts of one interview. This one aired on November 25th, 2019. This was a fun time because myself and David Stewart went more deep into the fictional writing of characters, story arcs. We talked about Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and some anime because he is an anime fan. So this was a good time. I'm looking forward to talking to David Stewart sometime again in the future on one of these ventures because he's a wealth of knowledge when it comes to characters, storytelling. Like, he's got a whole channel. Check out his channel where he not only talks about music and games and stuff like that, he also gives advice for up and coming fictional authors. So if you're out there and you want to write a book like for kids or for young adults or whatever, and it's fiction, fantasy, he can tell you like tips on how to get it published and tips on how to organize it, structure it, how to do maps and things like that. Like, really a wealth of knowledge this guy has. So don't sleep on David Stewart, y'all. This is episode 30, so let's go ahead and talk about it. Let's go ahead and listen to it right now. Now, I want to ask you about one of the issues that it has to do with Star Wars, but not really, and that's writing a lot of characters. So, and this is what I'm trying to pick your brain on here because this has been a challenge for me. So when I was writing my novel, because for those who don't know, I told you a little bit about it. I was writing a novel a few years ago. I ran into a problem where about halfway through the first act, I introduced a bunch of new characters that I didn't know what to do with them. Now, this is a rookie mistake. Happens to a lot of writers. I'm going to probably trash the entire thing and start over again. But the reason why I'm bringing that up is this. So I see something like The Force Awakens, right? Where you've got all of the legacy characters. You've got all of them in there. And then you've got, on top of that, all these new characters. Do you feel, first of all, in your opinion, that there were too many new characters introduced? If that makes sense.
In Star Wars?
In Force Awakens. Like, when they came back, do you think that they introduced too many new characters?
Well, I don't know. I don't think so. Because if you look at it as the beginning of it, I think it's just they didn't sell the characters that they had and they didn't write them well. The prequels introduced a ton of new characters and then even killed them off in the first movie. I think it's okay to introduce characters. Usually, though, and in fact, you want to stick to exposing characters efficiently, and you do kind of want to focus on one main protagonist. I don't think they did that necessarily poorly. I think that they used the original Star Wars movie as a model as far as what scene construction they were doing in what order.
Right.
But I just don't think they thought very much. I don't think they thought about the characters right. I think it was an execution thing. Well, I don't think it was too many characters.
Like, you have Phasma, who was built up, does nothing. You have,
Good point.
You know what I mean? Like, stuff like that. Like, you've got Leia, who did a little bit. She did just enough. But you've also got the new droids, the old droids, Chewie. I'm not saying you have to do something magnificent with all the characters, but I feel like it's more challenging to sit there and say, okay, I'm writing this story for the old fans and the new fans, transitioning from the old to the new with this many old. In other words, do you think the old characters had too much equity and loomed too brightly, had that shadow cast over the new ones? Because I feel that way sometimes, but at the same time, because I feel like if they had done 7, 8, and 9 100 years in the future, right, where there's no Luke, no Leia, no Han, they may have had more success with that. I feel like the treatment of the old characters is really what I think hurt this, but at the same time, you can't just make them the main characters again. I mean, I guess you could, but it's not what your goal is. So I feel like that's a challenge, transitioning from old to new.
Yeah, I think it is. I think because this is a corporate piece of art, I think you can't get out of the corporate shadow. Because an author or a tour would approach it differently, but they had to have the old characters because they were really constructing something that was heavily influenced by a desire to serve nostalgia.
Yes.
And so when you understand it from that perspective, then the inclusion of certain things is mandatory. You have to have the old characters. You have to have the old aesthetics.
Yeah,
The
TIE
prequels have really
fighters.
different aesthetics from the
Right,
beginning and
right.
from the original trilogy, and they look great. But instead, they went with an aesthetic repetition. It really was, J.J. Abrams. I don't know. I can't have too much to say about J.J. Abrams, but I think it's probably reasonable to say that he couldn't have full control over something like this without risking other things. Like, he had to really play into what the expectations were, which was to have a nostalgia-based movie to kind of cash in on previous love of the franchise. At the same time, you want to try to make other things there, so you can't just have the old characters and that's it. You kind of had to have the new characters on some level, I guess. I guess they could have had the old characters though.
I mean, it's just hard. It's just I don't envy them. Now, how do you think when you're writing a novel though, you have more breathing room, I guess? Like, what is the challenge in writing a character when you have a lot of characters? Like when you have a lot of characters, like for example, let's take let's do Lord of the Rings, right? Let's go easy on that. So you've got sort of Frodo and Sam, the main character and the sidekick. Then you've got like you mentioned before, Pippin and Merry, who are like the rambunctious kind of duo for comedy purposes for some of it, not all of it. And then you've got like the real like top heroes, which is like Aragorn, Legolas. These are the battle the heroes that have experience in battle, if that makes sense. Then of course you've got Gandalf, who's the old wise man. But yet somehow Tolkien was able to get all of these characters to be likable. And that's one thing that I think that makes him so underrated as a writer, is that it's really hard to read a piece of fiction and like every character. It's really hard, and he pulled it off somehow.
Yeah, I think they're all variations of very real normal people. I think that's why it comes off that way. As opposed to a lot of times, especially with movies, you get into the habit of making caricatures rather than characters because it's more efficient to have a caricature than a real character. And I think that's kind of what you have in the new Star Wars movies. You have like General Hux is really a caricature of an incompetent villain. And so people start, he's so incompetent. How has he not been force choked to death or something,
Yeah, but that's how it was in 8. He wasn't that way in 7, if you remember. That was Rian Johnson with his BS again.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I don't know. Yeah, I guess
he was Space Hitler in 7.
Yeah.
In 8, he's like a bumbling buffoon from the very beginning. It's bad. Yeah. But I mean,
so you get kind of caricatures. Even Space Hitler would be a caricature. It's okay to have static characters because some of them are going to be static versus like deep 3-dimensional characters.
But the static ones end up dying.
With movies, you got to be very efficient though. So that means you really can only focus on developing a couple of characters in a single movie. Otherwise, you're going to be having a really long movie, or you're not going to do enough development of any of them for them to really matter. So, it's like, I don't know, if we took Matrix, pull Matrix out of the air as a movie, the only real development, there's primary development of Neo's character, and then some secondary development of Trinity.
Right.
And that's it. No one else really changes. All the other characters are pretty much static. They're, in some cases, like Morpheus is kind of a paragon caricature. They fit into these archetypes. So static characters are just quicker to do. So I think actually now that we're talking, having too many new characters might have been part of the problem of the newer movies, in that you introduce lots of characters that you then do not commit to developing. So they either need to be static characters that you quickly understand, or they need to be characters which you're going to take time to develop. You can't do things half-assed. So Poe is a really good example. Poe, there's not been enough screen time for us to really give a shit about Poe or anything that he does. We barely meet him in Force Awakens, and then he has some sort of like power struggle arc in The Last Jedi,
right,
which isn't even really executed very well. he gets a bunch of people killed and then has righteous indignation about being chastised for it. It's kind of it's a funny thing. So we don't really develop him. We have Rose Tico gets introduced, and her development is
atrocious.
Her development is like knocking the ship out at the end. Like, she doesn't change until she just decides to change at the last minute. It's quite bad.
Have you seen the latest scene?
Rey doesn't really change either. She has an endless bag of tricks to get through every single obstacle.
Have you seen the latest scene where Rose bites Hux's finger?
No.
Oh, it's so bad. Dude, the deleted scenes, you need to see these just for your own.
They're appropriately deleted.
Oh, dude.
The best thing Rian Johnson did was delete these scenes.
Man, she bites Hux's finger when they're about to get like decapitated, and he literally, I swear to you, dude, it's like Tom and Jerry. He's like, "Ouch, ouch, she bit me." I thought I was watching a Monty Python skit, and I love Monty Python, but dude, it was so bad. Like, how could somebody look at that and think it's good comedy? Like, how can we take him seriously ever again? Sorry.
I don't know. And it's bad comedy. Also, I mean, like, the comedy that exists in Star Wars is the kind of comedy that you got from the old pulps, which is a comic relief. And so comic relief takes a different form than standard comedy. This is actually one of the strong points, I think, of the MCU. The MCU does comic relief generally pretty well, and you're pretty aware when it's not done well. Right. So one of the things you notice is comedy is almost never done by the lead. The lead almost always plays things straight, and the comedy is performed by some other character, we'll call the comic relief character.
Yeah, like Pippin and Merry.
Yeah, so the comic relief characters in the original Star Wars is mainly C-3PO. So C-3PO is constantly he's the reacting jester, you know.
And
he's the
coward.
Voice of the audience, remarking about the incredulity of the situations and what's happening. You know, all the things that C-3PO says, his kind of neurotic nervousness, all of that is there to help us laugh at the situation. But you notice, like, Han occasionally says something funny, but Luke really never says funny things. You know, sometimes there's a funny situation, but the comic relief really is generated by these sort of outside. And so it doesn't disrupt the drama.
And Han's comedy is witty. He's not a bumbling buffoon. He's just more of a smart ass.
It's not a Three Stooges kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is you always take Han seriously.
Yeah, it's like, who you calling scruffy looking? That's a good little bit of comedy there.
Right, or even when he says, you could use a good kiss. Like, that's a great line. Yeah. I can arrange that for the Wookiee. But again, we're dealing with a very charismatic actor as well, like you talked about.
It's like he doesn't pull your arms out of your sockets when he loses, right? So there's these little comedy elements there, but they're kind of from the story. They're not there to degrade anyone. And then most of the comic relief comes from a non-main character. So if you have comic relief coming from one of your primary characters, I'm trying to think of the right emotion for it, but it elicits an emotion in the viewer or the reader that is kind of unpleasant. Things feel awkward or cringy. And so when you have Poe crank call Hux, that's not, it's an attempt at comic relief, but it doesn't work because we don't want Poe to be funny. Poe's witty. He's supposed to be Han Solo, but we don't see him crank calling people somehow. Like, that's ridiculous. That's not, if Han Solo's not the kind of guy who crank calls anyone.
Right. No, I agree with you on that.
And Poe's really not the kind of guy to do that either, as far as how his character actually plays out. Poe's a genuinely nice guy and a bit witty, but he's not like a crank caller.
Yeah.
Likewise, Hux as a commander, it shouldn't be a bumbling buffoon. Now, what would have been funny is if Hux had like a sideman. If Hux had some sort of sideman who got bit, you know, then it's funny because you're shuffling that comic relief onto another character that's there to be annoying and to be laughed at. He needed a Jar. If they were going to do that, he should Binks like Jar Jar Binks is the comic relief character of the Phantom Menace, by the way.
Right, of course.
And a lot of people hated him, but I understood what he did there, which is just to shuffle that comedy. Like, could you imagine if Jar Jar Binks was doing if instead of the comedy associated with Jar Jar Binks, it was Obi-Wan. If it was like Obi-Wan sticking his head in the little power
and frying his tongue. Yeah.
Yeah. Could you imagine, like, people would hate that?
No. And what I like, too, about the prequels is that if you notice, in Revenge of the Sith, both 3PO and Jar Jar have virtually no scenes at all. And there's very little comic relief in that movie. There's some light-hearted stuff between Obi-Wan and Anakin early on, but that's more of that buddy cop type of comedy, which I think works for, two Jedi who have been friends for decades. That works. That makes sense. But when they split off, which I think is a key moment in that film, when Obi-Wan goes to Utapau and Anakin goes to the council and starts to spy on Palpatine and that whole thing happens, everything goes to shit, which I do like that about that film. But notice how from that point forward, the tone of that movie, there's like no comic relief, which I think was very well done. I think that's how it should have been. Yeah.
Yeah, it's appropriate. It's a darkening. It's the closing of the
right
of the cycle.
And I feel like even the scene, like people have laughed at the scene where the Separatists are like, but Lord Sidious promised us peace, and he just gets sliced. Like, I don't think that was supposed to be funny, because I remember the way that John Williams had sort of done that soundtrack with the way he used the opera. It was like a horrific slaughtering. It was almost like you could have put that theme when Anakin's destroying the Separatists. You could have put that scene into like a Jason movie or a Michael Myers film would have fit, because he's just slicing them up. He's like a Terminator. He can't be bargained with. He can't be reasoned with. When Sidious told him, go kill the Separatists, he just showed up and just started carving them up like freaking pieces of meat. And I love that scene so much. I thought that the scene with the younglings was unnecessary, but that scene right there just showed like Darth Vader's ruthlessness. You know what I'm saying? And it was not played up for laughs at all.
Yeah.
I love that scene.
Yep. And yeah, it's a great point. And then that's it. A lot of times comic relief is not appropriate. When you have a lot of tension, comic relief is there to give the audience a feeling of some relief of the tension of the plot, because you're pulling this tension all the way to the end of the movie where you're finally going to release it. Comedy's there to just kind of lighten things along the way, so you don't just feel utterly
so it's not
annoyed
depressing
and want to turn it off, which can happen if you really have the tension cranked up high. But anyway, in the original movies, most of that was shuffled off. Even Yoda, right? Like Yoda does some funny stuff at the beginning of Empire Strikes Back. So it's almost like you started with a copy of Empire Strikes Back, where you have Luke like throw the lightsaber over his shoulder, and it's like an attempt at comedy. But we already know who Luke is. The comedy for Yoda works because he's a little weird green puppet. He looks like a comic relief character, and the surprise is that he's actually a Jedi Master.
Right. Which is why,
a piece of comedy.
And I've said this before, watching them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 does not work, man. It's got to be 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. There are certain, like even the way that the Force is explained by Obi-Wan in A New Hope, we don't get that explanation in the prequels. The prequels assume that you already know what the Force is, and that's, in my opinion, that's why. And you could probably shed some light on this too as a writer. Writing a prequel is really hard, I feel, for any writer, because you have to think about, is the audience going to watch this first or not? And here's the problem is, if you watch them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, not having any knowledge, you already know who Darth Vader is. So when he reveals to Luke that he's Anakin Skywalker, it has no impact on you at all. And that
So this is another bigger, broader topic. What order should you watch the movies in?
Yes, but I mean,
say
just as a
watch
writer,
the original trilogy and watch the prequels.
Right.
I probably would agree with you on that.
But George Lucas doesn't want you to do that, and the problem is he did not write the prequels with that in mind. And to me, that shows his flaws as a writer. I was just trying to ask you as a writer, like, what would you have done? Like, just you being a guy who's written stories. Let's go back to 1999. Let's say you got put in charge of the prequels. Would you have written it the way he did, or would you have sort of reintroduced everything with the first movie and kind of tried to not allude to old trilogy shit until at least the third one?
I would have done a lot of things differently, but and the main thing I would have done differently actually is I wouldn't have had Anakin be a kid. I know that doesn't answer your question.
No, but I agree with you that Phantom Menace was supposed to
He needed
introduce
to be older for us to because he was supposed to be kind of the hero of that trilogy. He needed to fit into that everyman role. Instead, he comes off as like a little Mary Sue little kid who builds C-3PO in his spare time and accidentally blows up a starship. It's very cringy, I feel like.
Very cringy. Right. But I mean, like, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
No, I mean, like, as a writer, besides just that, like, if you were writing a prequel to, say, one of your own books or whatever, would you sort of reintroduce, would you do more world building early on in that story, or would you just sell it to where you're assuming the audience already knows everything?
It's hard
tricky.
to say.
It's tricky. That's why I have you on here, man. I'm asking you the hard questions.
I'd probably know what's going on, because it allows you to, I mean, like the universe really grew with those prequels. Like the world, the universe really grew. We got to see a lot more exposition of just some amazing things. So I really probably would have focused more on that and changed the way the characters were revealed. I think the part of the problem with the prequels is that there's so much to try to cover in those 3 movies that it's a difficult task. We have like a Clone War thing going on that could have been its own 3 movies,
right?
Easy.
Well, it got like 5 seasons of a TV show. So
I probably would have combined the first 2 movies into one plot. Have Anakin as an adult that meets Padme and protects her as like a pilot in some random place rather than a slave. I don't know. I wouldn't have gone so heavy on having him start as a child. And then have the second movie be focused on the war, with the third movie having the betrayal elements happen a little bit earlier. The way the third movie happens is you have a standard kind of 3-act movie, but then you have an extra act.
Yeah, it's a 4-act structure.
Yeah, you end up with a 4th act at the end, which is it's really cool, actually. It's really good. I think it's actually one of the most unique kind of formats for a movie now that I've gone back and watched it since it was released. I think it actually is one of the most unique Hollywood movies I've seen.
But
it's
also,
not a Hollywood movie.
It's really. also very rushed, though. That movie's very rushed. They try to cram a lot into that movie.
They did. And that's the thing. There's a lot to cram into this. We don't have this. Dooku should have been the initial big bad. We should have held off on revealing Sidious. There's lots of things that I would have done differently. But it's not my project, right? It's George Lucas's project. So there was things he really wanted to emphasize, and you're always making some compromises with your stories. Because you can't put in everything you want, or it's so long no one wants to see it.
That's the
it's
problem.
Just hard.
But when you're writing a novel, you have a lot more freedom.
Yeah, you do.
That's the thing. It's like, and that's why I feel like I always feel like when I see a movie reviewer review an adaptation of a book and always compare it, it's not really fair. It really isn't. Like, you're very limited on you have to in a movie. The book, it could be basically any length that you want it to be, as long as you're able to keep the reader's interest and keep them feeling good about the story or wanting to turn the page. It could be as long as you want. I mean, Stephen King's written books that are 1,000 pages, 500,000 words or something, and a lot of those are considered really good books. They're really interesting beginning to end. Well, let me ask you about that. You once said that you felt like Stephen King was underrated and overrated at the same time. I'm kind of curious. Yeah. I think I know what you mean, but can you expound on that?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, there's a lot of circles that hate Stephen King simply because he sells a lot of books.
The haters. Right.
Yeah, and that's basically, you step onto any college campus, nobody is going to, anyone who likes Stephen King is going to like Stephen King secretly. So that's a thing. People hate him because he's popular. People hate J.K. Rowling because she's popular. People hate Star Wars because it's popular. People hate things that are popular.
Right. Even though they secretly love them sometimes.
Even though they secretly know they're good, Right. So Stephen King's like that. The other thing about Stephen King, though, is that Stephen King writes all of his books what we call by the seat of your pants, meaning you begin writing a book and then you just write a book. So you don't really have a plan for what's going on.
You mean he's a discovery writer?
Yeah, that's another way of putting it. So some people call it gardening, pantsing. Basically, he doesn't go to the book with a plan for what plot points he's going to execute when. And so there's some benefits to that, which is that the book flows of its own accord. So if something isn't interesting, it's just not there in the book at all. It doesn't matter whether it's needs to be part of some plot structure you've invented to impose upon the story or not. It just, things go, lots of character development, lots of scenes that are just interesting in and of themselves, but they often don't end well. In other words, he doesn't write well with an ending in mind. So the endings are often feel out of place. Sometimes there's not an ending to the book. His endings are very weak compared to, say, his exposition. His exposition is actually really good, but one of the reasons the endings are weak is that the exposition makes promises about the ending of a story, and Stephen King doesn't usually deliver on those.
Do you think that he's too detailed?
No.
Okay.
No. People like the detail, but it's all, the devil's in the details, because it's all in execution. He gives details that he thinks are really important to a story, and if the reader agrees, then it's not too detailed. If the reader doesn't agree, or the reader simply wants plot to come out and hit him in the face, then it's going to be awful. He totally has diarrhea of the word processor. He admits it, but that's not a weakness to me. Other writers are exceptionally detailed, and people don't give him crap about it. I think it's really just that he doesn't have a good flow through of plot. So the books about 2/3 of the way through tend to start to drag, and you don't know what's happening, and then they just end, because he doesn't go into it with a plan. Whereas people who plan it out a little bit, they know that at a certain point in the story, they're going to have this big twist going to happen, and the reader's going to be really sucked back into the book and really kind of pushed to the end and want to see what's there. Stephen King doesn't do that. Now he's underrated by a lot of, just don't think the stories are worth the popularity they get. I think his strength is characters above anything else he does. I think his characters come across as really interesting, really likable in a lot of cases, really just enjoyable characters that people really remember and think about. And I think he starts with characters. Most of his stories start with a thought of a character rather than a plot or even a setting.
Yeah, no, and that's what this whole thing's about. So, real quick question for you. How do you write? One of the problems I struggle with when I was writing my novel is dialogue. I think it can be a bit challenging, because sometimes one thing you're trying to avoid is you don't want all the characters to sound like you. You know what I mean? And I feel like the only way to get better at that is to read more books and watch more movies. That's the only thing that makes sense to me. Or to just be around more people.
Yeah, and it's hard to be around a diverse set enough of people to really know what other people are going to say.
I know,
so
it's tricky.
Reading other books is good too, but yeah, you got to get out and have some life experiences. And it's something that comes across to me, particularly when writers are writing something that I know that they haven't experienced that I have. It's like very obvious. So one of the things that happens, and this annoys me in Hollywood movies, is the portrayal of like lower class blacks and gang members in particular. They have this portrayal that's like, I don't know if you've ever been to Compton, right. I don't know if you've ever been to South LA to think that people act, look, or sound like this. It just comes across as like a caricature of what people sound like, rather than what anyone actually sounds like, or what
it
life
becomes
is actually
almost
like in an area.
It's like almost comedic in some ways.
Yeah, they're like, man, we need a really bad guy, and they invent what their mind imagines is like an MS-13 member, and it's like, I don't think you've ever seen a gang member, man. Like, you got to get out and live your life a little bit. That doesn't mean you need to go down to the ghetto and get robbed or something to be able to write about a gang member. But it does mean that, like, I don't know, maybe show it to other people who are a little more diverse in their experiences. That's one that pops out to me, because I've been to a lot of different places, whereas things that probably wouldn't pop out to me is like if somebody is from Brooklyn, right? Like I think I've been there once, but couldn't tell you anything about what made people in Brooklyn act like people in Brooklyn. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, but then when you talk about like sci-fi, it's harder because very few of us have ever flown a starship. So all you can do is either compare it to flying an actual airplane, a real plane, or
it's
just
going to be what you imagine.
what you imagine.
And actually, there's a good point that I want to make here too, which is that a lot of times writers in the fantasy and science fiction genres tend to transport people from our world into a fantastic world. In some cases in the actual story, but what I'm thinking here is that the characters act, look, and feel as if they are from our world.
Right.
Not as if they're born from the setting, which is unique. So people that live in space are probably going to think and act a little bit different than we are. You don't want them to think and act too different or they become unrelatable. But especially with something like fantasy, a lot of new fantasy writers tend to go either too far in one direction or the other. They make the character completely alien, like it's from, like they're from a different planet, even though they're really from 14th century Italy, or they make the character just like us. They make them have mannerisms that are very modern, thoughts that are very modern, considerations that are very modern. I made this point before. Like if you have you wouldn't have a samurai in Edo period Japan thinking deeply on the nature of natural rights, or or object to the society that he lives in because he was raised to think his society is normal and appropriate. So he wouldn't see the mistreatment of some class of people as bad or evil. That's our modern view looking at that. But that it happens all the time in fiction. People have basically modern characters judging the past. That's a really common thing right now, actually, in fantasy and sci-fi is just like long pieces of dialogue judging past.
Well, wasn't the idea of Romulans to be Russians? I mean, that's the way I always saw it.
Romulus was to be Roman.
Oh, okay, it was Roman. I thought it was Russians.
Yeah, the Romulans are Romans. Now, this is why they have another sister race called the Remans.
The Remans, yep.
Yeah, because Romulus and Remus were brothers that were raised by wolves. They were sucked on drank from a wolf's milk. And they were the founders of Rome. I think Romulus killed Remus. I'm trying to remember the details of the myth, which are just kind of hazy on my mind right now.
It's been a while.
But they were having some kind of conflict over either where they were going to build the city or what they were going to call it. And Romulus ended up killing Remus, and so it was named Rome.
But wait,
so that's where they got it.
I thought that the neutral zone was like the Berlin Wall. I've always thought that. Am I wrong in thinking that?
It could be that too, but Romulan is named after Romans, and they have a societal organization similar to the Romans.
Similar to the Romans, okay, yeah, that's.
But the neutral zone could be like a Korea thing, because in Korea, between Korea and South Korea, there's a demilitarized zone, just an area that you can't really go into, Yeah.
Yeah, the border.
So that's kind of what I thought with the neutral. I really thought it was like a Korean War thing, but you could easily say it's kind of like a Berlin Wall thing. Just the separation between socialism and the capitalist West.
Right. Yeah. No, I was just curious about kind of picking your brain on that aspect of it. Because it is tricky. I mean, it is because we live on Earth and we've never talked to aliens, at least not most of us have. But it's tough. And that's why you have like Han Solo saying, "I'll see you in hell," in Empire. And it's like, wait a minute. So if he's saying hell, does hell exist in the galaxy far, far away? Do they believe in a Christian God or in a Judeo-Christian God who talks about Hades and hell? Like, you know what I mean? Like, you wonder about those things. But then you remember it's just a piece of fiction. You shouldn't overthink those kind of things, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, it is fiction. So it's okay to think about it, but if it doesn't fit, don't try to force fiction into allegory. There's different layers of allegory. It could be just a light allegory. To me, like, it's just light allegory, not really. It's a heavy allegory would be like everything in it has some sort of significant relationship to reality. Light allegory would be like, it's just a general thing that's kind of like what we're used to seeing.
Right. Yeah, no, for sure. So that was my original point. How do you struggle with writing characters, or do you struggle with writing characters that are different from, like, that have different, not so much different aspects of your personality, but how would you go about writing a character that's very different from you? Like, would you model it off of a person you know in real life, or maybe a character you've seen in a novel or in a movie? Like, what are the tricks to kind of doing that?
That's a good question. I think...
Because I feel like every villain that gets introduced in these McHollywood movies, they all, and not just that, in books too, they all have that over the same properties that make you a villain. They're all very overconfident. They're always cackling. You know, it's like a very Saturday morning cartoon. I mean, look, one thing about Last Jedi, going back to it, is, I don't know if you picked up on this or not, but Snoke comes off like a real buffoon in this movie, because when he's like going in on Rey, like, I cannot be betrayed, you know, I see him turning the lightsaber true. I'm watching that scene and I'm like, this is from a Saturday morning cartoon. I feel like I'm watching Sonic the Hedgehog at 8 a.m. in the morning, and he's Robotnik. This is not like, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm saying, well, I guess it is a bad thing. I guess it's cheesy, you know, because Rian Johnson wants to sit there and pretend like he's reinventing the wheel, and so do his defenders. But yeah, he's got a villain who's pretty much a wispy, mustache twirling, you know, overconfident moron.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, he is like a Snidely Whiplash like character. And there's a word, yeah, Snidely Whiplash. That's just kind of what we call really grotesque villains. Villains that are just evil, and there's no reason for them to be evil. If you think about the original trilogy, Darth Vader repeatedly tells you his motivations for things. He's like, you know, we'll put an end to this destructive conflict, right? Like, Darth Vader's ultimate motivation is order and peace.
Right.
And so how that transforms into something really wicked, it's
murder.
really easy to see that.
Yeah,
it's really easy to see that and to understand that.
It's almost like Nazism. I mean, really, it is. A lot of it is based on Nazi Germany.
Yeah, it is kind of like a socialist thing. We just want order and equality and peace, and damn it, we'll kill everyone to get it.
Right. So about writing the characters, though, like, are there tricks to this, or anything you can throw at us, the audience?
Yeah, I need to do some more content on like writing villains in particular, because you don't want to write Snidely Whiplash like villains. But as long as a character has a motivation which is understandable, then they will feel, and you come from that, then they're going to feel and act in ways that are appropriate to that motivation. So somebody like, I don't know, if you think about somebody who's an abuse victim, right? And they're going to have some kind of motivation that's going to go down to not being able to trust people and trying to avoid being hurt, right?
Right.
Now, obviously their character, therefore, is going to articulate those things through their actions. If somebody gives them a chance for intimacy, they're going to withdraw from that. A lot of times we tend to think of character traits as just traits that exist without some kind of fundamental thing bringing those traits into existence in the person. So like somebody who withdraws from touch and things like that is somebody who may have been abused as a child. So if you start with, okay, this person, they need to have intimacy problems, or maybe they're abused as a child, you start from that perspective, and then you're able to really build a very three-dimensional character, and you can construct it out of pieces of other people that you've known. You know, everybody's known somebody who's been maybe abused, so if you're going to make a child abuse victim, you think about the person you know who's abused. Maybe you met them when they're an adult, talked about their experiences, how they feel. You can, you know, do some reading from somebody who is writing blog posts or wrote a book about their experiences to help you think about what this character would feel like. And then when you write the story, the character is going to act and say things that are appropriate to that motivation. So that's probably the better way to approach it. With villains, I'd like to say with villains, you know, you don't have to overthink it. They need one good motivation for what they're doing. But it's been the thing for a long time now for the villains to have some sort of noble motivation. Like, I don't see the pursuit of order as necessarily noble. It's understandable, but not necessarily noble. Versus people who are convinced that like Thanos had some sort of noble purpose. Thanos had no noble purpose. I don't think the directors intended for him to really have a noble purpose, but I think behind it was that overpopulation thing. Which is BS. But there's so many people who are like, Thanos was the good guy. It's like, no. He had a reason to do what he did. That doesn't mean that he's a good guy. People do bad things for. That's not even a good reason, you know.
Well, no, I think a good villain thinks he's doing the right thing. Like, that's the funny thing
Yeah.
about great villains. They all think, and obviously there's other examples like horror monsters and things like that. But I mean, you know, a good classic villain thinks they're doing the right thing. And I think that works with Vader. Right. And to be honest, you know, it doesn't really work for Kylo because he wants to rule everything. That was what they implied anyways in the previous two films. He wants absolute power, but he doesn't necessarily want order. I mean, he never really has said that. In fact, he's not even a character himself who's very organized. Whereas I feel like Vader, you know, he thinks he's doing the right thing. He thinks the Empire is good. He thinks the Empire is the way things should be. And they even hinted at it in Attack of the Clones. Hello?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, no, I thought you were going to follow up with that. And then you have, for example, in Lord of the Rings, you have Saruman, who, the way I always perceived him is, he's somebody who wanted more power than he already had, and he realized that joining with Sauron, in his opinion, would be the only way to get that kind of power, and he was wrong about it. That's the way I always perceived him.
Yeah, I think, well, he studied the devices of the enemy long that he came to desire the power for his own ends. You know, he wants the ring to order the world in a certain way. But of course, power corrupts.
Right.
So those are all really good points. I think that's where you start with, and you start with a reason for why he'd want that. You know, and those motivations I think are in the prequel trilogy kind of worked out for Darth Vader. When it comes to protagonist type characters, you just want him to have a couple of common experiences that people can relate to, and maybe some uncommon experiences that are of interest to a reader. So, you know, the protagonist could be, you know, he could be an Iowa farmer, but, you know, his mom was an entomologist, and so he knows a lot about bugs. So he has like one interesting thing to say. And so the things that he knows about bugs, maybe they have something to do with a story about aliens that are insectoids. You know, I don't know.
Yeah.
So you wanted those things to kind of work together, but of course, like he's gonna be knowledgeable about some things and about others.
Well, it's like
what's his high school experience like? Was he the star quarterback? Was he some other guy?
Well, it reminds me of what they try to do with Jeff Goldblum's character Independence Day, which is, you know, he was this nerd who knew computers, and then somehow him being a nerd knowing computers helped them discover this virus that was able to infect the aliens, which again is extremely, extremely cheesy and unrealistic, because I find it hard to believe that an alien race who is coming to Earth and is way more advanced than we are would allow themselves to be inflicted by a computer virus. But at the same time, that's an obvious homage to War of the Worlds. So I kind of tend to forgive it a bit more knowing where it came from.
Yeah.
You know, and plus, you never know.
Yeah, you may have been able to. So yeah, I mean, those are the things that I think about for building three-dimensional characters. Yeah, you don't want characters to you, but if they've had experiences that are significantly diverse from you, then you're going to be thinking of how somebody, and this has to do with like our theory of mind. You know, you meet another person, you start to talk to them, you start constructing a theory of how their mind works so that you can understand a social relationship with them. This happens with every social encounter that you meet someone and they say, I'm a teacher. You start thinking about your experiences with teachers to kind of predict how that person's going to act. It's a really normal way that we start to get to know people. And as you talk to them more, they reveal more aspects of their character, and eventually you create a model of how that person's mind works so that you can actually have a social relationship with them. That is getting to know someone. It's creating a model in your mind of how the person is going to think and act and feel so that you can interact with them. If somebody feels offended by something you said out of the blue, that's very surprising. You know, especially when we feel like we know somebody, if you've never had that happen.
Of course, yeah.
So, you know, you use that same techniques to make a character. You have to. It's a model of how that person's mind works, and we do this with all the people we meet. Maybe it's another leap to do it with a fictional person. But if you imagine you're talking to somebody and they're telling you about their past experiences, you're going to construct a theory of mind for the character. So like when I design characters, I usually write down just a couple of things about them, like where they're from, what they did, maybe what they like, and the rest just kind of happened through the story.
So before we close out of here, I wanted to ask you one last thing. What do you think is the most important trait of an iconic character? And I'm talking about in all forms of fiction. We're talking about Captain Ahab all the way to, I don't know, Batman. Like, what do you think, in your opinion, if you can summarize what the most important thing of a great character is?
So for me, I think it actually, rather than saying a thing about a character, it's an event that shows you something about the character. So there's always a moment of truth that really defines a character, the classic characters, where either the character will not, say like with Count of Monte Cristo, the character will not give up on his revenge. Or if it's like Ahab, he won't give up with his revenge,
Right. That's his whole thing.
It could be a moment where, say, like with Samwise in Lord of the Rings, where he has the ring and he has the opportunity to be the hero, and he gives that up because he's not. And he has a very truthful understanding of himself that he's not, as much as he might fantasize about being the great hero, he needs to save Frodo. Frodo needs to be, he needs to complete the journey with Frodo. So there's these moments of truth that happen with characters. And if the character never has a moment of truth to test their virtue, to test their motivation, to test their mettle, then we don't get as strong of an impression about that character as we do if they do have a moment of truth. With Luke Skywalker, it was, not killing his father. So that was definitely an important Luke. There's also, let me think of a couple of other important moments of truth in cinema. You have a moment where, say, they could destroy the Terminator in Terminator 2, and I think this was actually a deleted scene, but it was actually a really important moment, which is they were taking out the Terminator's chip out of his head to destroy it, and John wouldn't let her destroy it. So his belief that people are worth saving is absolutely tested in that moment. We get a better impression of him. Let me think of some other books or movies that have that moment of truth.
Yeah, I guess you can call it like the moment of clarity. Well, I don't know if that's really the right way to call it. That's more of an alcoholic thing.
It could be a moment of clarity. It could be it's where the character fully understands himself, or it could be a moment where the character has to fully embrace his virtue or vice in order to accomplish what he has to do. So it can happen with the temptation. That's what we like with virtuous characters, is for them to resist the temptation.
Right. It's like when Luke sees his hand and he sees Vader's hand cut off, and then he throws the lightsaber and says, "I'll never turn to the dark side." That's his moment. Like, you have failed, Your Highness. I'm a Jedi, like my father before me. What a great movie.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's it. That's the last moment of truth. And he fails kind of a moment of truth in Empire Strikes Back, where he refuses to listen to Yoda. Yeah. And he suffers a big consequence from it. He suffers a downfall due to his hubris, which is appropriate. Yeah. So those kinds of moments really kind of show the character and really let people attach themselves to a character and feel that character was worth something. Is why people like Westerns. Westerns are full of these moments. Westerns always center around that moment in the final act where the character has to decide to either do the right thing or do the wrong thing. And so usually if the character does the right thing, it's a really powerful moment. So if you look at something like, of course, High Noon, it was completely built around that moment. If you look at something like, say, Open Range, which was a Kevin Costner movie, mm-hmm. They decide to fight the guys instead of moving. But it's not just that. There's a surprise moment of truth where he asks someone who hurt his friend, and the guy says, "I did it," and he immediately pulls out his pistol. Right. So he's just displaying this character who's kind of reluctant, but is absolutely hard as bricks and has no problem has no problem taking revenge at that point.
Well, I think
he's completely forthright.
Another great example is The Matrix, the first one itself, because the scene where they have the camera behind Keanu Reeves and it turns and then the music changes and then Morpheus says, well, first Tank says, what is he doing? Morpheus says he's beginning to believe. And instead of running away, he is choosing to stand up against the agent, which had been told to us through over time and time. This is a very well-written movie. Time and time again, that these things cannot be killed, and that when you run into an agent, you run. And it's such a well-written story because everyone is warning him that you cannot compete with this thing. But if he truly is the one, the only way he's going to be able to realize that he is the one is by facing the one thing that other people who are lesser than him, who have failed before him, have failed against, and that is the agent. It's such a well-written scene and a well-directed scene, and it's perfect because it's been built up so well throughout the entire movie. I mean, one of the great things they did in that movie was what I like to call the sacrificial lamb storyline, where you have Morpheus, who at one time was equal to him during the training sessions, getting destroyed by this agent. That's always a very powerful thing, and they do it again in Rocky IV, where Creed ends up getting killed. Like, whenever you have the previous villain. This is something that they do a lot in Dragon Ball, the main thing I cover. Whenever the previous villain gets destroyed by the new villain, right? It's like telling the audience, okay, everything that's been built up is now history. Now we have a real threat.
Yeah.
It's just...
Yeah, exactly. That is like another too. And Morpheus has his own moment of truth there. He's resistant to the agent. He refuses the taunting of the agent. This is kind of talk about sacrificial lamb. This is kind of like the torture of a saint before martyrdom, or the torture of Christ. You can think of it like that. I don't think he's a Christ figure, but it's similar to what historically you would see with that. Is that you taunt somebody before you execute them, so that they die demoralized without their mind on what is right, without their mind on God, essentially. So I think those are great. Those are great examples and great moments.
Yeah.
I like Westerns. There's so many good ones. Tombstone is it's literally full of those moments.
Well, great movie.
Where, he decides to they decide to go have the shootout at the OK Corral. It's like, you have to back your brother's play. He's like, hey, I'm going to do it. He has a moment of truth where he could walk away from it, as he's been telling everybody he wants to do, but he doesn't. He does the right thing. And then he pursues his long path. When Doc shows up to fight Ringo, that's a moment of truth.
And Doc was sick.
Doc. Yeah.
No, it's great.
Daisy Tall.
I'm in my prime.
Yeah.
What a great movie. All right, David, man. Thank you so much for spending time here with me. It really means a lot to me.
Yeah, Go ahead. For having me.
No, anytime. I would love to have you back in the future someday to talk more about, picking your brain on stuff, if that's okay with you. Go ahead and plug anything you want to plug.
Sure.
Your books, your channel, anything, man. The floor is yours.
Sure. So I got I've written a bunch of books now. I just came out with, I think, my 10th book. So that one's called City of Silver. People at least really like the cover. It just came out, so I don't have any reviews up. Brand new. Now, a little bit of a story behind this one, behind City of Silver, is it's a dark fantasy book. It's actually one of the first books I wrote, but when the first time you do something, you tend to not be very good at it. And so that was a little bit of the case with this book. It needed some heavy revisions. It's actually the first part of what'll probably end up going out to about 12 books in the series. A big portion of which are already written, just have to be edited. Again, because it's early writing, it's rough. I did a lot of things wrong.
Wait, so you've got a 12-part saga already ready to go?
Yeah, dude. As far as the story goes, it's done. In fact, the first 1, 2, 3, there's going to be 3. Probably the first 6 books are written. They just got to be edited. So this is the first one. I had to do the most work on that one because it was the worst writing that I've done. Right, when you first do something, you're not good at it. You gotta, you need a little practice. But my wife really has a strong attachment to the story because I would send her the story as I was writing it. We were living in separate cities at the time before we got married. So it'll be interesting. I'm not sure if I'm going to even read any reviews for it because I just kind of want to not let that affect me and just go for the story as I want it. So that's the newest one. Voices of the Void is my sci-fi horror. I like to call it Lovecraft meets aliens. If you do join my mailing list, dvspress.com/list, dvspress.com/list, you will actually get Voices of the Void for free. You get a free version of the ebook. I think still get a free version of the ebook. So do check that out. I like to call it Lovecraft meets aliens, and I think I will have another free horror book or shorts. No, it's not a short story. A novella, I guess. Whatever. Short book. I'll have another one coming out this month in the horror genre, if you want like a monster story. Those are the big ones. I have a samurai book called Muramasa Blood Drinker. People really love that one. That was the one I wrote after City of Silver years ago. Just this new one, City of Silver, is coming out now well after I've written it. It's just kind of an interesting story about how early work can then be moved forward into the future.
The Dark Tower, man.
Yeah.
That got revised.
Then, yeah, it's true. And then what else? My YouTube channel, youtube.com/RPMFIDEL. And that will get you to my channel.
Or you can just type in David Stewart in the search.
Yeah, hopefully that'll show up. It might show up David A. Stewart from the Eurythmics. He's written, I wish I had his royalty check, but.
Right. I mean, I type in your name and let me see it right now, because it usually goes, I mean, I am sub to you. It goes right to you. You know, so I guess the best way to describe it is you kind of look like an 80s Kurt Russell.
Yeah.
So.
So I'm also a musician. My current musical project is called David V. Stewart's Zool, Z-U-L. It's ambient rock.
There is no Dana.
Instrumental rock.
Right.
So, there you go.
So now are you putting out an album?
That album came out 2 years ago. I'll probably put out another 20. Right now I've kind of figured out, because I'm so busy,
right, that
I have to focus on one thing at a time. And so after I finish this current little horror story I'm writing, if I feel like I can, I'm going to take some time and write a song and record a song. So eventually an album will get done from that process. I haven't done a lot of music really in quite a while, other than just practicing the lute and guitar here and there.
Right. Well, certainly that's something to look forward to. Always some artistic stuff, but my thing that drew me to you was your analysis of films, and I really enjoy watching that on your YouTube channel because it's always very interesting. Plus, you make some pretty good points. Like, I like some of the videos you've done on like non-existent arguments and things that people say. That's pretty good stuff. I mean, some of it is older than your newest stuff, but I mean, there's a lot of content on that channel, and so I guarantee people will find something to like on there, because there's a lot of different things. You know, you've reviewed films, not just Star Wars movies, but you also reviewed all Lord of the Rings films. You review some of the Disney stuff that's not even Star Wars. You've talked about that as well. And also, one of the things I'm enjoying is your I'm enjoying the Twilight
the Twilight stuff. I'm going to do more Twilight stuff. Next year I have a Vampires versus coming out, so I'll probably do more Twilight when I come out with that book. I have some really weird stuff kind of in the pipeline for 2020. I just have to get all my ducks in a row.
Because I feel like the Twilight stuff is great, because those books get so much shit. And it's funny because when you criticize them, you seem to be a bit more fair than other people are. You're not just sitting there trashing them.
I try to get out of the hater mode, you know, because it's easy to look at something like, so what? Let's figure out why teenage girls think it's cool, you know, rather than like trying to crap on the fandom because it's not for you. It really isn't for you. You know, it's not for me. Who cares? Like, that doesn't mean I can't enjoy it on some level or see like what's there that I think is worth paying attention to, or why its construction is appealing to people.
But that doesn't mean you like it. It's just you're more fair.
Yeah, it's not really the thing I would read normally.
Right.
But there's good things about it, just like anything. It's really hard to make. I've made this point before. It's really hard to make anything that's like less than a 5 out of 10, unless you're just like a movie, for instance, that's less than 5 out of 10. It's really hard to do that because you'd have to have bad production, bad writing, bad acting.
They tend to not come out.
Everything would have to be bad, you know, in order to get like a really low score. People are like, The Last Jedi is a 1 out of 10. I'm like, it's better than that. It looked cool. If just because it looked cool, it's definitely not a 1 out of 10.
John Williams has good music, I guess. Maybe.
Yeah, you can give. There's tons of good things about Last Jedi. It's just the characters and the story suck. So that's going to make it suck overall, right?
Yeah.
Like, you can't overcome a bad story, but you can at least look at it and be like, well, I really liked that red salt planet thing. That looked kind of cool. Those are some cool visuals.
Yeah, Snoke's ship is kind of cool. It's a gigantic wing. I thought that was cool. Like, really?
Yeah, I thought there was lots of great visual design in the movie. Absolutely great. It was mostly replicating original trilogy stuff, but whatever.
Yeah,
but that doesn't. So my point is that it's really hard to find really, really bad stuff. So I'm going to try to do more stuff like that. I really want to talk about Vampire Hunter D. So I'm probably going to do Vampire Hunter D for.
That's a classic movie, man. That is a classic.
I kind of want to do the books. I mean, the movie's how I got in because it was on the Sci-Fi Channel like back in the 90s.
Oh, I remember.
And it was like they called it Japanimation.
Yes, they did. In fact, the 3 movies they aired were. I
actually really like all 3. It was Vampire Hunter D.
Yep.
Venus Wars.
Yep.
Which has a bad boy girl character, by the way. That's the one. The girl in that one. I don't remember her name, but she's a bad boy. And what was the third one? Do you remember the third one?
I did. Okay, so I did a video on my main channel, which really was a big one, called, and the video was called The History of Dragon Ball Z on Toonami. And it actually wound up, the original intention of the video was going to be just about Dragon Ball, but I had to go all the way back to tell the entire story of Toonami. You have to go all the way back to, even before the Sci-Fi Japanimation stuff, you had to go back to Ted Turner buying the freaking Hanna-Barbera tape library. So I went all the way, I had to go all the way back to that. And I'm very proud of this video because I told the story. The actual evolution of the story. And one of the things that I discussed was the Japanimation movies that aired on there. And it was Venus Wars, like you said. It was Vampire Hunter D. And the third one was... And now my brain's not working anymore. Shoot.
And as soon as somebody... Was it Tank Police?
No, I don't think it was Tank Police.
Tank Police was another one I saw. Originally, I saw the original Tank Police. It was great, but there's a third one. But I'm trying to.
Robot Carnival.
Robot Carnival, yes.
Carnival.
Yes, I remember Robot. Yep. I remember being totally bored by it.
Yeah.
But the other 2 movies in that trio were just so good that Vampire Hunter D in particular just blew me away when I saw it. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The visuals, everything about it was just phenomenal. But I have the books, so you can read all of the Japanese novels. They have translations of them now, and they're actually pretty good reading. You lose a little bit with translation because prose takes on different techniques in Japanese. Obviously, writing, it's just going to be really different. So you lose a little bit with translation. Translation approach is not my favorite. With a lot of localization, they tend to put things into kind of the way that we talk.
Right.
They tend to paste on American
slang.
Idioms. Yeah, American slang. And I don't really like that. I'm like, just give me the literal translation. I know I'm reading a translation. So they do that. I think Funimation does that a lot. If I watch a Funimation,
I can tell you stories about. See, you're crawling into my area now.
Right?
I
know.
You're
probably know a lot more about that than me. I almost never watch the dubs for that reason. Is that there's always, especially with Funimation, just a lot of the dubs, man. And I don't hate the company or anything like that, but I tend to not like their dubs.
Well, they've gotten better throughout the years because they were really bad in the 90s. They were, in fact, all dubs were pretty bad back then.
Yeah, all the I don't ever watch the Berserk. If you've never watched the Berserk dubs, you almost have to because they're so silly. There's Berserk dubs where they just like added in dialogue. They were just missing the script. It's awful. The original Berserk dubs are really bad. No,
back in the day, the one company that would deliver the good dubs was Manga Entertainment. Manga Entertainment did the best dubs. They had Ghost in the Shell dub, which was great. They had the Ninja Scroll dub, which was great. Black Magic M66. See, I remember the old days of Japanimation. Everything felt so like collecting a new movie or a new series back then was like a treasure trove. But nowadays we're so spoiled because, you know, everything's on Crunchyroll or on Netflix, and, you know, it's just always there. Whereas back in the 90s, these things were not that easy to find. Blockbuster had like 4 or 5 of them. You had to go to the mom and pop shops to get the good shit, and a lot of that was pirated. Sometimes it was subbed with like 3rd generation, you know, copies, and people are never going to understand that weird struggle / joy that we had in the 90s. It's like music, like, you know, like back in the day, you go to the store and you find an album, whether it be a CD or an actual vinyl, and you're like freaking out. Whereas nowadays, you know, you find like even stuff that isn't even that like that rare, like even stuff like Band on the Run. You're like, hey, but nowadays you can get that stuff on iTunes for like $6, and you get that. It's like, it's not the same. It doesn't feel the same.
It's instant. It's not the same as it was.
Yeah,
like you have to go down to like Suncoast Entertainment and order something. Like that was like.
Oh God, it was always overpriced. It was like $22 for a VHS.
Oh, I know,
tape.
$20-$40 a tape. We used to get with your friends and you'd all copy the tape, you know. So
right.
Everybody. That's how I got my original copy of Lodos War. Was a friend got it, and so I just copied his tape, and we just did that. Someone would buy a show, and we'd all copy the tapes.
Yeah, and
there's no only way to get it.
There's
no TV. You didn't show it on TV.
No, and even then, if you did, it was censored. It was heavily censored. You know, like I mean, that's one of the problems with the old dubs is that they had to heavily censor everything. You know, everything was so homogenized and kidified. You know what people don't understand is that anime actually existed in this country in the 80s, and nobody even realizes it because Haim Saban was the biggest culprit of this. He would take, and not just with Harmony Gold with Macross becoming Robotech. I mean, even before that, you had like Japanese shows on
Voltron was one. Yeah.
But you also you had like these kid shows like the Noozles, which was, you look at it, you're like, wait a minute, that animation style is very different. Then when you grow up, you find out that it's actually a Japanese show called like Magical Koala, you know, Shinobi Koala, some long contrived Japanese name, and you're like, wait a minute, is this for real? And so all these cartoons that aired that Haim Saban produced were all Japanese, and as a kid, you had no idea. You had no clue.
Yeah. Yep.
We've had anime forever. Speed Racer. That's another one.
Speed Racer. Yeah, that's from like the 60s.
Yeah.
You know, the original 8-Man showed up on American TV back in like the 60s. It's like a black and white Japanese animation show.
Did we ever get Astro Boy back in those days or no? Do you know if we did?
I don't know about that. I know 8-Man we did.
Okay.
Because people have, you know, there's broadcast records of it and stuff, so.
Yeah.
It's kind of fun. I think that might have been the first one, was 8-Man.
Better days. Well, not better days, but I guess more
Different
innocent days.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun. But thank you again so much for being here, sir. And
thanks for having me.
No, anytime. And we'll thanks everybody for listening. Check out David on all his platforms, and check out some of his books as well. And if before you even check out his books, you want to check out his channel, it's, you know, on YouTube. Check it out. And there's always something happening. So thank you again.
All right. Thank you.
We'll talk to y'all later.